Hi, I'm Sifiso Khanyile, independent producer and director in documentary filmmaking. I'm an archives researcher and record collector and DJ. So I had produced a film before making Uprize, which I worked on as writer and producer. I'd initially made a documentary on Babu Endrum, and we worked with a musician who kind of worked mainly with like atmospherics. And I'd found that I also, by the way, work as I'm a judge, documentary judge at the SAFTAs. And so I watch all of these films every year, you know, so I think to a great degree, I pay attention to kind of the music that you find in these documentaries. And you find more or less the same sound, you know, sort of like more generic towards the, you know, sort of like atmospherics. How do I describe that sound? Sort of like droney instrumental tones, you know? I found that this has become the standard for a lot of documentary films. What you don't get a lot of is like percussive sounds in documentary. I was drawn to sort of the jazz music and musicians, one, because we have a really strong legacy of like jazz music in this country, but secondly, contemporary jazz artists in this country right now, I think for me, are just like, you know, have continued the tradition, you know. They're probably one of the best in the world in terms of like emerging jazz scenes. So I'm really excited about like South African jazz music, about South African jazz musicians, and I guess like just like jazz spaces in general. And I think for me, that was the attraction. I try to find a balance because I think to an extent, you don't want a film to be predictable. And as a filmmaker, someone who is just outside of the music space, you are well aware, or you might be well aware of what you want, but you never know what it is that you're going to get. So a lot of the time, it's experimentation. One of my favorite quotes about documentaries is that documentaries are moving targets. You think you have your story. I like to plan things down to the T, you know, I have my emotional beats in terms of like plots and, you know, just the narrative flow of the film. Think about the music and as far as in as close detail as I can. Think about the shots, think about the mood and the emotion of the film. But I'm finding that, you know, it changes all the time. And with these changes, it means that I need to adapt, and very quickly at that. Now, adapting to aesthetic decisions for a film might have budgetary consequences. It might have time and scheduling consequences. And so for me, it's really just about learning to trust someone else with the process, with the vision, and just like, you know, letting go. After you spend like months, sometimes maybe even years. I remember some documentaries, you might not shoot for some time, but you know, you might be planning and writing for 2 years, you know, minimum. Coming out of that 2 years of thinking about a film and thinking about what it feels, looks, and sounds like, and then having to, say the 11th hour, having to let go and let someone else take over, can be daunting at times, but it's also a great opportunity for you to learn the process. Uprize was my directorial debut. I'd worked as a producer before then, but I'd never actually, you know, directed a film before. And so what I learned from that process was that it's a collaborative effort. People tend to think of the director as the person who calls all the shots, who has all the answers. I learned that it doesn't work that way, you know? And as I mentioned earlier on, the documentary is a moving target. What that means is that you're constantly, you know, trying to locate the story, trying to locate the emotion, you know, trying to locate the tonality of the film. So working with musicians who I think deeply invested, deeply embedded in their craft and what they do on a tonal level, for me helps me learn a lot because I can see that they can easily interpret what it is that the message that you're trying to convey sonically in a very short space of time. And so then it becomes easier for me to trust my collaborators. You know, people say original soundtrack, and you take you take that originality can be taken for granted. It can be taken lightly. And just thinking back about like the process of making this film, right? Limited resources, we didn't have, I think we didn't have the necessary budget that was required to make the music for a film like this, with such a heavy story that relies on quite a heavy history. So, there's quite a bit of responsibility on my part and the musicians, right? To be as authentic as we can be. But we're also, in a way, we're paying homage to the youth of 1976, and we wanted to do that with, the utmost integrity. And I think for me, the musicians' honesty carried that moment and that process, in how they connected with the stories that were being told by the contributors in the film. If you think about some of those stories, we know the 1976 story, but history has kind of sort of washed it down to a very static thing, right? And now here we are getting these accounts of what was happening, for most of us, for the very first time. And I think for a lot of audiences, for a lot of people publicly, these were stories that were not shared about 76. So again, the musicians are sitting there and they're getting these stories for the very first time. A lot of these stories being, some of them heartfelt, some of them very sort of like haunting, and having to, on the spot, interpret that sonically, for me, is magical. They were not rehearsed. Didn't know what they were going to get, what was there to expect in terms of like the stories that would be coming in from the crew that was shooting and documenting the story. And so it became very interesting for me that they could be that open, that they could be that generous with their spirits, with their crafts, with the music. And I think that's what stands out more than anything. I think during the time of like releasing the film, I don't think there was ever a screening where people didn't ask about the music. The music has always been a very special part of the film. And it continues to be a very special part of the film, even as a standalone project, because it was that deep, it was that sincere. I think more than anything, the sincerity is what really came through. That was an experimentation because I did mention that I work as an archive researcher and I guess to some extent an archive collector, because some of the archive libraries that I deal with, most of the stuff hasn't been seen publicly. So for this one, most of these archives were in Vancouver. And I remember seeing these pro-apartheid films or apartheid propaganda films. And history is such an interesting thing because these are apartheid propaganda films that sort of like promotes the notion of separate development, right? In those films, they embellish how harmonious life is between the races in South Africa, And they'll show you Soweto, and they'll show you like, this middle-aged man getting out of his like, what looks like a middle-class house in Pinville in like the 60s, getting into his car, which is also just like, a Cadillac or a Dodge something. And they just talk about like how smooth things are going in the country and that kind of thing. And you just think about what was happening while this was being made, right? The kind of voices, the kind of narratives they were suppressing in order to advance the ideologies of separate development. And so you're taking something that had a specific purpose, right? And in a way, for me, it kind of reads as a decolonizing process because now you're attaching it to something that in itself is completely decolonial, This is this is a video for a Malombo song, Malombo being one of the, sort of like most original jazz inventions to come out of the continent. So for me, the subversion comes in that space because there's something at loggerheads here. You have something that was created in order to suppress your originality, your agency, self-determination to a degree, and you're using it in order to highlight or uplift that self-determination, the agency all of that. And so for me, that was very interesting, you know, and I did it, it was intentional, because you're sitting with material that you can't really use, because you're sitting with this, not the pain, but the, you know, this thing of saying, this thing has very little value, because I know what it was meant for. It was meant to suppress my people. And so there's very little outlet for that kind of sort of like cultural product. But history is interesting in that you're able to do these kind of things and you're able to manipulate them in order to suit your own narratives. And I think for me, that was an interesting experimentation, because it means that there's a lot more we can do with these kind of archives. We can own them. We can repurpose them to tell our own stories, you know, and to highlight our own narratives. That was actually, it was a lot of fun.